Hey, before we get started with the show, we want to let you guys know that this episode of the Comics Alternative is sponsored by Audible.com.
That's right. They have more than 180,000 audiobooks and spoken word audio products. They're the leading audiobook publishers, and you can choose such comics-related titles as Sean Howe's Marvel Comics, The Untold Story, and David Haydew's The 10-Cent Plague.
Get a free audiobook of your choice at www.audibletrial.com/comicsalternative. That's audibletrial.com/comicsalternative and get started today. This is a Comics Alternative special, a roundtable discussion on libraries and comics. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Specials. I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy, and we're two guys with PhDs talking about comics.
And it's not often that we have a special episode called, as such, a special, but we have one today. And this one is a roundtable discussion devoted to comics and libraries. And Andy, this is right up your alley.
Yeah, you know, when we started talking about this a while back, I've really been looking forward to this, and it's going to be a real treat to talk to other librarians who are working in the academic field. I'm really excited.
Yeah, we have a great conversation with both Carol Tilley and Rob Weiner, librarians and educators of librarians. But before we get to that conversation, we should let all of you guys know that this episode of the Comics Alternative is brought to you by the good folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There you'll find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off cover price. And every single month, including August, you're going to find incredible specials. Now, sometimes those specials are at 45% off the cover price. Sometimes you can find them at 50% off, and often you can find discounts that are more impressive than that.
And there are so many great things to discover here at DCB Service. One of the things that you can get, two of the things you can get, two new Image titles. You can Brian K. Vaughan's Paper Girls #1 at 50% off, and Greg Rucka's Black Magic #1 for 50% off. And as always, we have tons of bundles. We've got a DC Kids bundle. We've got a Secret Wars. We got Marvel Secret Wars titles at 50% off. And Derek, I don't know that we've ever seen this before. We have a Vertigo bundle that's 75% off.
Yow! That's incredible. Yes, and you really can't beat the savings at Discount Comic Book Service. So be sure to go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your comics there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you.
Yep, do that.
So Andy, let's go ahead and get to the roundtable discussion we held with Carol and Rob.
Yeah, let's do it.
We are pleased to have with us on this special episode of the Comics Alternative, Carol Tilley. She is an associate professor of the Graduate School of Library and Information Science at University of Illinois Champaign-Urbana. We also have with us Robert Weiner. He is the humanities librarian who works with graphic novels at Texas Tech University. And, of course, our own Andy Wolverton, who, as every listener knows, is a librarian who works with comics and graphic novels at Anne Arundel County in Maryland. So, everyone, welcome to this special podcast episode.
Hey, welcome, folks.
Hello.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah.
You know, this is the first time that we have had a episode devoted specifically to the issue of libraries and comics. Every now and again, especially with Andy as a co-host, the topic of libraries comes up, but it's usually in passing. You know, I'll usually ask Andy something about, you know, what is your experience with patrons on, let's say, a particular book or a creator, and he'll respond, but then we'll move on. But this entire episode is going to be a discussion on libraries and comics. You guys are the experts, so I'm sure that, you know, you can bring your librarian expertise. Maybe we can begin with each of you giving a little background about your work and your history in libraries with librarians as they apply to comics and graphic novels. So, Carol?
All right.
You start
I'm
the
happy
ball
to go
rolling.
first. Okay. Well, even though at the moment, and really for almost the past 20 years, I have been teaching librarians to be, many years ago, I was a high school librarian, and I often tell folks that when I started that job as a professional librarian, it really helped me understand that I needed to find a way to bring my lifelong interest in comics into the library setting, because it was that moment of coming into the library where I was employed for the first time and realizing that there weren't comics there, and that helped me understand that you know, I had grown up going to the library pretty much daily, and I still had to go somewhere else to get my comics fix, and I decided I wanted to help change that and make a difference. So for the past decade and a half or so, I've been studying comics and how they fit in libraries, and for the past 5 years, I've also been teaching a course for pre-professional librarians on comics readers advisory.
Okay, well, Rob Weiner, and I actually came to librarianship and comics through the public library first and helped build a rather extensive collection in public library here in Lubbock. And when I moved to the academic library, which is something I'd always intended to do, is to be working within academe, I, of course, took my interest and knowledge of sequential art and comics with me. And once the word got out that I was kind of the comic book guy at the university when I first got there, students started coming to me with their projects, and I started collecting some graphic novels here and there. The library, of course, had a few things. I helped build it. There was a list that Eric Wortham, in my book on comics and graphic novels and libraries, put together for Association of Research Libraries of titles that every academic library should have, and I made it one of my goals to get all 80 or so of those titles. And when we had some extra money one summer, one of the librarians there who worked with our electronic resources came to me and said, "Hey, I think what you're doing is good. Let's work together. What can we do?" And this was a goal that I had, and so we made it happen. And it's just one of those things that I've noticed this kind of shift, especially in academic libraries as well, that there's more interest as more and more faculty are teaching courses related to comics and graphic novels, that there is a need for comics and graphic novels in the academic library, in junior college libraries, as well as, of course, public and high school libraries.
Okay, I guess that leaves me. I'm Andy, and before I was a librarian, I was a teacher in the public schools. I was a band director for 15 years. During most of that time, I really was not into comics, so when I made a transition from teacher to actually bookseller for a few years to librarian, I started getting back into comics and getting caught up on a lot of the things that I'd missed, which was quite a bit. And when I started working in our system, I noticed that while we had some graphic novels in the kids area, the teen area, and some in the adult area, it was very, very limited. And like Rob, I'm seeking to now expand the graphic novel collection in our library system. But a part of what I do also is to educate the public, not just kids, but especially adults, as to what a graphic novel is, why they're important, why we need them, why it's not a bad thing for their kids to read a lot of graphic novels, which is a battle that we still unfortunately have to fight, and really just trying to really raise the level of understanding and appreciation of graphic novels.
Well, one question I have for you guys, all of you are professional librarians or have been librarians or teach librarians, is what is your comfort level with words like comics and then graphic novels, and do you feel that one serves your purposes and your patrons better than the other? Do you prefer one over the other? Do you feel that they're interchangeable? What are your thoughts?
I prefer sequential art because in academe it's always really important to sort of disguise what you're really talking about in nice words. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I am an advocate for the word comics, and I actively tell my students that I hate the phrase graphic novel. I think that for better or worse, it serves to stoke a little bit of fear and concern, I think, for folks who don't have a reasonable understanding of what that phrase means. And I think, too, that the term comics is a nice umbrella term. So it includes manga and, the Far Side and everything else you can throw underneath it.
My situation is a little bit different because a lot of times a kid will come into the library and say, "Do you have comics?" And I say, "Yes, we do," because we do have individual comics. We have things like Scooby-Doo, Batman, the typical really, really popular comics. But sometimes when they say, "Do you have comics?" they really mean, "Do you have collected editions of comics or graphic novels?" And things like that. So a lot of times it is a terminology problem, and I will usually say, "We have comics and graphic novels. How can I help you?"
Well, I kind of agree with Carol. I would prefer to use just the term comics, but there's still a real prejudice, as Andy has mentioned, against that term. And I mean, I come across it all the time. Where people look down upon the word, but if you phrase it in graphic novel or sequential art or something else, then other than comics, and then tell them that you're talking about comics, it eases that dialogue a little bit.
Yeah, where I'm coming from, I guess I agree with all of you or each of you in a different way, because when I say comics, I'm referring to the medium as a whole, as Carol pointed out. So It would include not only comic books or what many people call graphic novels, but also strips, manga, which is Japanese comics, and basically all of it, right? But when many people hear comics, they think of the actual platform or the delivery system. They think comic book. And I always, if I use and refer to graphic novels, it's as a product, a platform. It's that through which comics is delivered, just like a comic book is a platform through which comics are delivered. But I know, Rob, you and I know each other from pop culture conference days years ago, and I know that once we were on a panel and we were even discussing this issue of graphic novels or comics, and you had pointed out on this roundtable that for librarians, graphic novels is probably a better term because of categorization issues. Is that still the case that you guys are finding?
Yeah, that's true in terms of, category and cataloging for book length items and so forth. But as Carol pointed out, when you put the word graphic there, sometimes people think you're talking about adult material. Or, some of the people who really hate the term point out that something like Mouse, well, it's not a novel, right? It's not fiction. You're fighting over semantics here, but with the word novel, which which we often think of as fiction. So, but as Carol pointed out too, I think we're sort of stuck with that term to cover everything, And
I think one of the important things to point out is that, just because I don't like the term graphic novel doesn't mean that it doesn't have value. As both Andy and Rob are pointing out, and I think we all are touching on, we need to use the words that our patrons are using, that our community of users is using when it comes to talking about comics. So if we've got kids coming in and they're asking for something and they're using a specific term, we need to be responsive to that. And I think that's one of the big issues that all kinds of libraries really need to face up to is trying to figure out how we provide access to this stuff, how we talk about it, how we display it in ways that are understandable to the people who are coming in and using our collections.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah, I agreed, Rob. I think we are somewhat stuck with the term. But one of the things that we try to do is kind of expand the definition of what that means. We actually, I haven't done it this year, but for the past few years, we've done a display in the library of the Eisner nominees and winners. And of course, there's quite a bit of diversity in the Eisner Awards.
Yeah.
You've got children's books, you've got adult books, you've got archived editions. You've got all kinds of things, and our collection is getting big enough now that we can do a pretty respectable display. And a lot of people will see something like an archived edition, and they'll say, "Wait, this is in the graphic novels section." And we'll have to explain, oh yeah, this is graphic novels encompasses a lot of different territory. And like you mentioned, Mouse is a great example because a lot of people, actually that's on our reading list. A lot of the kids in the schools, that's on their reading list, so that's one of the books that they can choose to read. And so a lot of people of course a lot of people everywhere are familiar with Mouse, but that kind of opens up the door to like both of you mentioned, the graphic novel, nonfiction graphic novel is a different, is kind of a different term for a lot of people, or a lot of people maybe don't understand that nonfiction can be included with that. So I think we're just trying to expand the knowledge of what people think of when they think of graphic novels.
Can I share a interesting story from the public library days with you, speaking on that very topic? Do you all remember the For Beginners series? Like
Yes.
Floyd for
Yes,
Beginners?
yes.
Oh, yeah. I think they started with Pantheon back in the late 70s, early 80s.
Yeah. And I consider those graphic novels or comics, if you will, or very comic-like. Anyway, we had a volume, Darwin for Beginners. I'll never forget. Mm-hmm. And it was over with the regular nonfiction. And the moment we recatalogued it, this is while at the public library, and put it in the graphic novels section, which was a separate section, it circulated within 2 days. And it hadn't circulated in years.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What,
Yeah, placement and how where we locate this stuff really does make a difference, I think, in use and accessibility.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right.
Now, you're on this topic of where you place or how you categorize a text. Whether it's listed with the other or it's placed with the other graphic novels, or maybe placed with children's books. I mean, this opens up the question of definition in very interesting ways. I'm thinking in particular of Sean Tan's 2007 book, The Arrival. And Carol, you know where I'm going here, I think, because
yes.
you're laughing.
Yes.
Something like that could easily be categorized in the children's lit section, but it could also be categorized in the graphic novel or comics section of libraries. And so I'm curious, how do you deal with something like that as a librarian? And Carol, when you're teaching future librarians, what do you focus on in terms of defining and distinguishing the medium?
Those are two huge questions, but let me take the first one about works that cross boundaries, like The Arrival does, and even to some extent, the For Beginners series that Rob was just mentioning. When you have something like that, it's really important, again, to go back to the community that you're serving, the users, and I emphasize that a lot with my students, not just in the comics class, but across the board. And the idea is you have to have a clear understanding of who the people are who you're serving, what the purpose of your library is, and that guides your collection development, that guides where you place items within the library, how you catalog and classify them. All of that goes back to your community of users. And so with a book like The Arrival, you need to think about where it's going to find its audience. And for some libraries, that might be in the children's picture book section, or for some libraries it might be in YA fiction, and for other libraries it might be in a comics or graphic novels section. Some libraries get around that issue of the books that straddle different categories by purchasing multiple copies and then placing them in several different locations. So one thing to realize is that the cataloging and classification, when you classify a book, it can still have multiple locations. So you have an intellectual or virtual surrogate for the item, and then you have the physical places where that item is in the library, and it gives you a lot of flexibility that way. In terms of talking to students about these boundaries, I think that my approach is to be broader than narrower in defining what makes a comic. I think that there is a lot of overlap in terms of comics and, say, picture books. And I think that there's a great definition, I think from maybe Yuri Shulevitz. I probably have the person wrong. But he talks about how with a good picture book, you don't know where the words stop and the pictures begin. And I feel that the same can be said with comics. It's that sort of seamless integration of words and pictures that makes comics work. And so I think that there is some pollination or hybridization across, say, picture books and comics and other kinds of formats and media.
Well, and one only has to look at the works of like Lynn Ward and Franz Mansfeld, and I mean there's a whole study now of comic scholars going back and actually saying, well, we own this now, but what are they, but picture books in a way. but without words, right?
Right.
But they're still sort of sequential narrative, or the original graphic novels, if you will. And so it's like you say, Carol, this hybridization of all these genres of where the types of things that are being done have some similarities, but there's some striking differences as well.
Because I've always been curious, and this gets back to the terms that we use to define the medium and to draw, albeit fluid boundaries at times. When you use phrases like, let's say, graphic narrative, and that's one of those terms that I think years ago I felt much more comfortable using, but now I'm like Carol, just call it comics, because things like graphic narrative, that's highfalutin. Come on, and those in academia, they get accused of being highfalutin enough. So, but if you take the term graphic narrative, it can mean a lot of things outside of comics, right? If they're visuals, if they're graphic elements, then why couldn't you apply it to things like picture books or even film, really, for that matter? And if we have comics where, in essence, one panel consumes an entire page for either part or maybe even most, if not all, of the narrative, then how is that different from what we would normally call picture books? And so it's this kind of fluidity between formats that kind of problematize these terms, and also getting back to libraries, how you classify, where you place, and how you recommend to patrons.
Yeah, I think what you're talking about, Derek, is really one of the issues I see with something like the Toon books from Francois Mouly. A lot of those, they have all of the conventions of traditional picture books. And sometimes, especially with the ones for the earliest readers, there's very little about them that is indistinguishable from a conventional picture book. So what makes something like that a comic or not a comic? What makes something like, Where the Wild Things Are a picture book and not a comic? So there is that fluidity. There are some challenges to figuring out what counts and what doesn't.
Carol, I'm glad you mentioned Toon books. We started seeing a lot of those in the library. And, I have never had a parent come up to me and say, what's this graphic novel doing in the easy reader section?
Right.
Because they don't care, because the kids are having a good time with it and they're learning from it just the way they would any other easy reader. But you're right, because we're also seeing a lot of picture books that are basically comics in picture book format. It's sequential art, basically without the panels, sometimes with the panels,
right,
and without the word balloons. But you may have two or more, we would call them panels, even though there are no boundaries on a page. So it really looks and functions like a comic. But again, parents no one's complaining. No one is marching around the library with with picket signs or anything like that. And I think in a way this is a great thing, because they are able to use the format without really even knowing that they're doing so.
Yeah, when I teach the Comics Readers Advisory class, it's intended for all ages of readers. And when we talk about comics for kids and young teens, I ask my students to choose what I call some hybrid comics to read. And that's sort of where the Toon books and things like, maybe like Melanie Watt's Scaredy Squirrel series, books like that come in, because they sit at that boundary of comics and picture books. And I think that they can be, that style of storytelling can be a good bridge for parents who might be uneasy, handing their kid a conventional comic. But they're books that kids want to pick up, they want to read, and they're subtle enough in their use of comic storytelling that even perhaps reluctant parents and teachers can give them a pass.
Carol, where would you put something like Baby Mouse?
I consider Baby Mouse a comic or a hybrid.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, there's the whole series, whether it's Baby Mouse or even Captain Underpants, where does stuff like that fit?
Because, I mean, half of Captain Underpants is narrative, it's just strict text. But there are comics, little c, within it,
Yes.
Well, in many ways, that's like the invention of Hugo Cabret that also came out in 2007. I mentioned The Arrival, because that's one of those that is, well, I guess is primarily prose. But then again, there are these really large sections that are paneled sequence, what we call comics.
Mm-hmm. Same thing with Wonderstruck as well.
Yes.
Well, and doesn't that kind of go back to what was the book that was it? I want to say Gil Kane did in this. I may correct me if I'm wrong. Black something. That was a hybrid, like from 1970, was a paperback that a famous comic writer / artist did. I'm drawing a blank. It's a real famous book.
Are you talking about Black Mark?
Yes, Black Mark. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I think these kind of hybrids or difficult to put your finger on titles are really interesting, because it does ask us to step back and question the way that we would normally, maybe without critically thinking, categorize, or at least how we would frame things. Now, early on, Andy, you mentioned something about parent reaction, and one of the things I'm curious is the kind of questions, responses, sometimes negative responses, that you get from patrons regarding comics or graphic novels in public libraries, and if you get anything similar in college and university libraries, in terms of how you categorize something, whether something is a little too explicit or not. Because, as we all know, you can have prose that is explicit in terms of language, sex, and violence. But if you have a visual representation of that language, sex, and violence, then that has a much different impact to readers, especially parents. And so I'm wondering, what have you guys experienced in terms of patron and reader reaction to certain, let's say, questionable or borderline comics?
Well, Derek, let me address a couple of points too, and maybe my first point is one that probably Rob and Carol don't have to address, except as educators. I'm sure you have to speak to this issue with your students. But when a parent comes up to me, and normally we get a lot of this every week. We get a parent or a grandparent that says, my son, my daughter, my grandson, my granddaughter just does not like to read. What can I do? And I actually love to have that, because that's a great way for me to get to know that kid and to find out what do they like, what movies do they like, what shows do they like, what video games do they like. And okay, let's see if we can find something like that. And invariably, I will take them to the comics graphic novel section and explain to them that this is a way for them to not only develop reading, because you've got words and pictures, and for a lot of kids, comics are more than just a transition to be able to read bigger books, but it is an important element of that. And sometimes, I would say overwhelmingly, the vast majority of parents will say, okay, we'll take some of these home. There are a few that say, no, I don't want my kid reading this. I don't want my kid reading comics, graphic novels. And I'll say, okay, let's go in this direction, and we'll do something else. But the interesting thing is, I would say 9 times out of 10, those parents that do have their children take those graphic novels or comics home, they will come back and they will say, this is great. They're reading. And they're reading not only comics and graphic novels, they want to read other things too.
Well, what's interesting for me is that I oftentimes have faculty or even students come up to me and say, well, they learned to read with comics, or that they remember that their first reading material was comics, or something like that, you know. You hear a lot of people say those kinds of stories as though it was some sort of urban legend, but it's really not.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I've had lots of people tell me that. So, but in addressing your question, Derek, about censorship, if I may go back to my days as a public librarian, we encountered some problems. And something that Carol said earlier too, you have to know the community that you're in, especially if you're dealing with public or school libraries. Academic libraries, there's a little more leeway, although you still need to be careful in terms of what you collect. But I can remember back in the public library days getting a graphic novel biography of Eminem, and practically every word was the F word on the page. And there's one scene where he's like, you know, he has a fantasy about killing his mother and things like that. That was not really going to cut it in Lubbock, Texas. You know what I mean? So that was taken out of the collection. We had some parents. This was pre my days there. I would never have ordered Robert Crumb for the public library. We had a parent complain about a Robert Crumb book, and it came to my attention, and the particular scene that they were upset about came to my attention, and I was like, I could, plead the fifth on this one because I had no knowledge of it. So,
which Crumb story? I'm curious.
There's so many to choose from that might have something questionable.
I could still see the image in my mind, and it's not pretty.
Okay.
I would rather not think about it. Let's just say it has to do with, well, I'm not going to say anything more. But I also remember having to write a letter defending a Dragon Ball book because somebody didn't like that a bare breast was being shown. That was a book that was worth defending because, it was Dragon Ball. And, one of the most popular, at the time anyway, series, and, that the object in question or panel in question was not that offensive by most community standards.
So if you take a look at the last couple of decades of book challenges that have been reported in the U.S. in schools and libraries, the most common reasons, regardless of the format, whether it's fiction or nonfiction or a comic or something else, is that they're challenged for being inappropriate for their age group, or they have some kind of sexual content that someone finds objectionable. The violence in comics that you might find in comics and certainly plenty of other media doesn't really register in terms of book challenges. But I think that one thing that, and I'm going to sound like a broken record, is going back to the knowing your community, but also using your library's collection development policy or selection policy and really looking for reasons to include an item rather than to exclude it. I think that we never know with any material how a reader or a viewer or a listener is going to respond to it, and what might trigger something, some sort of negative feeling or even positive feeling with material. And so I think the best that we can do as librarians is know our community, have a good policy in place, and really follow it as we're building our collection of comics and other materials. And also having a good materials challenge policy in place so that when parents or community members or even our fellow staff members might raise objections to materials, that we have a process and policy in place to guide how we consider whether or not to retain that item in the collection.
Carol, I think you hit the nail on the head about knowing the community, and I think that is so important. We try to do a really good job of being very careful about where things are placed. As far as comics and graphic novels, in our library system, we have an adult section, a young adult section, and a kids section, and there are comics and graphic novels in all of those sections. Our job as librarians is, when things first come in from materials management, is to make sure that they're labeled correctly. We've gotten a lot of books that have been that look, if you didn't know anything about comics or graphic novels, if you look at the cover, it looks like a children's book, but it's not. So we have to be very careful that things end up in the right place. Our community pretty much knows that the adult graphic novels are going to be in the adult graphic novel section, and they depend on us to get things right. But, we don't always get things right. And we do get challenges sometimes. Most of the challenges that we get are not involved with the graphic novel section, but they're usually involved with, high school kids reading something like Slaughterhouse-Five or a certain DVD that's in the collection. But we do try to defend what we have purchased and, remind patrons that the library is for lots of different people with lots of different tastes. And just because you don't like this movie or graphic novel, there are other people that enjoy it. When push comes to shove, we would probably remove the item, but we do try to defend what we have purchased.
Well, and I think that's true of a lot of places and a lot of libraries when push comes to shove. Not always, of course, but the squeaky wheel and all that.
Right.
Well, I have a couple of my own experiences in mind when I was asking the question about explicitness and library and patron reaction, whether those come from adults or from younger readers. Two instances come to mind. And one is actually not library related, but it's something that surprised me nonetheless. A number of years ago, I was delivering a paper at a conference, and I was giving a paper on Mark Kolesniko's Mail Order Bride. And in looking at issues of ethnic dynamics and identity there, in the story, I was showing some scenes in an overhead, or I guess a PowerPoint, of a rape scene or an attempted rape scene. And I can't remember how I was using that scene. I mean, I wasn't just throwing it out there gratuitously, but there was a purpose behind it. And then in the Q&A after the panel, I was a little surprised that a couple of scholars were disturbed by my use of that, and they weren't even addressing the point, whatever it was, I can't remember, that I was making in the presentation. And so I asked them, I said, well, what if this were represented in prose and I was describing the scene? And the response was, and more than one person said this, if it were in prose, it would be different. The fact that it's visual, it makes it much more immediate, visceral, and disturbing. And so, and that stuck with me ever since. So my question about the visual impact and how that's different from maybe the way that prose would reveal the exact same thing strikes me as curious. And then in my other experience, and this is library related, when I used to teach at Texas A&M Commerce, and I was the first one to really teach courses devoted either mostly or even exclusively to comics. And so when I started to do this a number of years ago, I just started ordering or recommending the library order graphic novels or comics like a madman. So I was just, filling out one submission form after another. And I remember one day I was teaching a graduate level course on comics and ethnicity, and my students came to me one class and said, well, apparently a number of the graphic novels that you've been ordering for the library have come in. And I said, oh, well, how did you see them in the stacks? And I'm curious where they were. They said, interestingly enough, there was a special section of our library there that was devoted to children's and young adult books. Well, they had gotten a lot of the graphic novels that I had ordered and were displaying them in the children's. Now, okay, some of the examples, different volumes from the Hernandez brothers, Charles Burns's Black Hole. So books like that. So the librarians had gotten them, just assumed because they had pictures in them that they were for younger readers, really didn't know much of the content and didn't take the time to look at it. And so they were displaying this stuff. And so I contacted the library and said, some of those books that you have front and center in that section on display, you should probably open the books, open the cover, and just see, and especially like Gilbert Hernandez, the way that he draws Luba. I mean, come on, that doesn't need to be there. So, so I guess ignorance of the medium as a librarian can have an impact as well.
Well, I would say two things, Derek. I think those are two great anecdotes. And the first part, the ignorance bit, the profession of librarianship spent pretty much the entire 20th century either excoriating comics or ignoring comics. We started bad-mouthing them around 1906 or 1907 and didn't really let up until, the late 1990s. And there were some folks who were more hands-off or slightly positive about it. But for the profession as a whole, comics just didn't register as a medium worth understanding, worth investing in, worth thinking about. And so there is a lot of education still to be done for our profession in terms of the medium and its role within the library setting. The second thing is, I think there is really something to be said for that visual factor in how we think about books. One of the things I do with my library school students is I will, bring in a couple of hundred comics during one of our class meetings, and things that might be small press or independently published, or things that they might not easily find in a library collection. And it's interesting that a lot of them, get really freaked out with the erotica and, softcore porn stuff like Alan Moore and Melinda Gebbie's Lost Girls. And they're intrigued by it, but they think, and will say, I could never have this in a library. And we talk about that because, libraries across the U.S. Collected Playboy as part of its holdings. Yeah, I mean, it was in, more than 500 libraries at its peak circulation. Libraries, have wait lists. Or have had wait lists for the 50 Shades of Grey books. We have the all kinds of sexual health and sexual pleasure books in libraries, but there is something about that visual depiction of sexuality and sexual pleasure that really makes people uncomfortable. And I don't know how to get around that. I think that's a cultural issue here in the U.S., and that has a less easy solution than maybe the education part for figuring out what comics can do for us.
Yeah, and I don't think there's an easy answer for librarians to figure out how to solve. that problem either. You know, I think that's what you're getting at, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think you're right. It's one of those things that's, you know, we've been battling this, as you said, Carol, for a century or more. Not just with graphic novels, but you know, especially lately. But I do agree that, you know, something you mentioned earlier, that so many people are so much more accepting of violence, depictions of violence, than they are of sexuality, and it's that double standard that we've had for such a long time.
You know, and that gets back to something that we were talking about toward the beginning of our conversation, and that's the use of the word graphic and how certain people can take that and you know, maybe misapply it. And when
they do, and they still do.
Yeah. A couple of years ago, I began leading a reading club at my local Frisco, Texas library, the public library. They have a variety of reading clubs, and you know, some of them deal with, let's say, science fiction. There's one that's manga and anime, and primarily for younger patrons. But they didn't have one on comics and graphic novels. And so when I was working with the librarians there, I proposed this. Why don't we do one of these devoted to graphic novels and comics? And so they said, yeah, if you'll lead it. We put the phrase graphic novel in the title of the reading group. And for the first several months, it was basically me in a room by myself once a month, waiting around for about 30 or 40 minutes, knowing someone wasn't going to come by. And then I thought, okay, well, maybe it was a problem with timing and scheduling. I was trying to hold out the possibility that, people do like comics. It's just that it's not at a good time, this reading group. My wife pointed out maybe there was something about the term graphic novel that some patrons think that it's something a little more explicit, maybe sexual or even violent in nature. And at first I kind of poo-pooed that. I said, you know, even if people don't read them, everyone knows what a graphic novel is. But then I pulled back and thought, maybe not. Maybe my wife is right. And I did eventually, over months and months, start getting people to come to the group. It wasn't just me in a room by myself, but not that many. And it got to the point that just a few months ago I told the library that, you know, I really don't have the time to do this if not many people are going to show up consistently. I can't help but think that the phrase graphic novel had something to do with the lack of popularity of that reading group.
I have no doubt about that. I mean, I think it really is. It's a terminology issue. And I think certainly, you know, 15 years ago, if you had used the phrase graphic novel, the connotation for most, say, parents, teachers, everyday people outside of the comics aficionados world would have been that it was a book filled with sex and violence. And I think there's still that remnant, most definitely, among the non-comics readers world.
Derek, if I can share a quick story about somewhat similar to your experiences. I run a book club at our library called the Guys Book Club, and it's for just basically that, guys who like to read. And most of what we do involves history. Sometimes we do novels. And these guys are generally older than me. I'm in my 50s. They're usually in their 60s or older. And I decided to do Mouse, which, you know, I know everybody's read, but I thought that would be a good book for them to read. And we met, and I said, how many of you had read a graphic novel before tonight? And not one hand went up. And then we talked about, okay, let's talk about what the term graphic novel means. And then a couple of hands went up, and they said, does Peanuts count? Or does, you know, something like that. And I said, well, yeah, that's comics. And we discussed the book, and so many of those guys said, I was apprehensive to start this, but I had no idea that this book was going to affect me so powerfully. And we did spend a little bit of time talking about some of the things that Scott McCloud talks about in Understanding Comics, about things like how a universal figure like a smiley face is much more, that could be anyone. So, we can invest ourselves into that character even though he looks like everybody, whereas if it looked exactly like Clark Kent, then that's Clark Kent. But I think those guys walked out of there with a huge, an eye-opening experience about what sequential art can do. And some of those guys mentioned to me, I don't think that story would have been as effective had it been only a prose story in the same way, or had it been a movie, it wouldn't have been the same experience. And I said, you're exactly right. You've gotten the gold star for today. So I think a lot of what we do, especially where I am, is just trying to educate the public and to tell them that, this is a legitimate form of storytelling. It's, graphic novels have won the Pulitzer Prize. Graphic novels have won the National Book Award. It's a legitimate format, and it's a great format.
Well, Andy, you're referring to yourself as an educator here, and now I'm wondering, maybe this is an easy answer for you, Carol, given what you do, but what is the linkage, ideally, between a librarian and an educator, whether it be grade school, high school, or even university and college, in terms of comics and graphic novels, or whatever we choose to call them?
Well, I'm not sure if I'm going to take your question the right way, but I think that all librarians are educators.
Thank you, Carol.
Yay!
Yes.
Yay! We're all teachers.
Yes, absolutely. There's a movement among school librarians, there has been for a few decades now, to use the term teacher librarian. And I really think that is powerful regardless of what kind of library work you're involved in. Not all educators are librarians, but all librarians are educators.
Amen.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Yes.
I didn't mean to offend. This is where my ignorance of library science comes into play. And what I meant by that is, because my experience is on the educator, the strictly educator side, not librarian, because those who teach courses, again, whether they be in high school or universities, you create a syllabus. And, I believe that when you create a syllabus, you in some way contribute toward the formation, for better or for worse, of some kind of canon, over time. The kind of text that you choose to introduce students to, comics and then otherwise, basically helps to form their perception of, that genre, that subject matter, that theme, or whatever is involved there. And so I'm wondering, okay, let's look at when it comes to, let's say, the formation of a canon, right? I'd like to believe that we don't have a comics canon. I think that there's a de facto one, whether we'd like it or not. Andy mentioned earlier using Mouse as a reading group. I think we can all agree that if there were a comics canon, that Mouse would be one of the most prominent examples within that canon. How do you think that librarians, either, with classroom activity, those who engage in direct, teachers, professors, how do you see yourselves as participating in the formation, or maybe even the resistance, of things such as canons?
My particular area of librarianship is, well, I won't say it's the only one, but I'm most invested in what people call youth services librarianship. So my students are primarily folks who are going to be working with children, teens, whether in school or public library settings. And for the last century, people within youth services librarianship have been very active in perhaps creating a canon of children's literature through awards like the Newbery and the Caldecott medals for best children's literature and best children's illustration. But I think that shouldn't be a but. I think we still do that to some extent where comics are concerned. because we do within the library community give them awards and put them on different reading lists and promote them in that way. However, I think that all libraries and the librarians who work in them have to create collections that are uniquely supportive of the people that they're serving, the communities that they're serving. And I don't think that every library collection should look the same. I would say that, Mouse is a wonderful book, but it doesn't belong in every library collection. So although we do canonize some materials through these awards and through these best of lists, I don't think we are actively creating a canon, and I don't think that we should as librarians, as a profession.
Might I jump in for a second?
Oh, sure.
Just in terms of collection development, and one of the things that I've noticed, or that I advocate, however you want to put it, oftentimes we talk about, like in academic libraries, that, well, the academic library serves to support the curriculum of the university. And that's true. And usually that's true of every academic library would argue that point. But we sometimes forget, as an academic library, that we're also to support, not like a public library, but to a lesser extent, recreational reading too. And graphic novels and comics can certainly come into play there as part of that. One of the things that I've noticed in our graphic novel and comics area in the PNs, although everything is spread out with Library of Congress depending on how it goes, like Persepolis is still in the young adult area, which I don't think it should be in, but but one of the things that I've noticed is that it's one of the most used sections, even if people aren't checking the books out, which they don't always do. They're looking at them, they're reading them in the library. So, it's a different way of looking at things. And the other thing, and this is really sad considering the name of this podcast, but it's still the superheroes I have tried to get a lot of the alternative independent books that are on lists, some of the edgier material that is more thoughtful. Not to say, of course, as we know, that I'm a big proponent of superheroes. It's what I study and read. But I read other stuff too, as you know. But it's always, it's a lot of times it's the superhero stuff that gets checked out and that gets used, even in the academic library. So I don't know. I'm just throwing that out there for comments.
Well, I guess that's where I was going with the example of the canon that I threw out there a moment ago, and because I know how easy it is as a teacher, as an instructor, to always fall back on a text that has been successful in the classroom and then tend to use it over and over again. And then after a while, that's what a lot of the students come to understand is, of course I've read Mouse, or of course Persepolis is an important book because I had it in a couple of my courses.
Or The Watchmen.
Or Watchmen, yeah. Maybe to a lesser degree than, let's say, Mouse or Persepolis. And so I was wondering if, as a librarian, you say that, Rob, you were actively going out and trying to accumulate a larger collection of not only the alternative, but also the superhero stuff that probably wasn't going to be used or referenced at all in classroom use. So I wouldn't necessarily call that, let's say, resisting the way that certain instructors, professors, or teachers may use comics in the classroom, but it's definitely providing an alternative. And so that's a more active role, I think, as a librarian, and not just merely supporting what, let's say, a teacher says, oh, can you make sure that you get this book because I use it in the classroom?
Well, and even at Texas Tech, mouse and Persepolis is used in a number of different classes. Mm-hmm. So it goes back to that issue of canon. Is there a definite one? No. Is there one that when we hear the word canon, people think of certain books? Unfortunately, yes, I suppose. But Mouse is an important book, and this idea that the fact that, Andy, you went to Mouse to use it, and the fact that there were all these people who have never read it, but it still resonated with them, and it still proved to be a powerful book after we've thought that everyone had heard of it, mm-hmm. It's simply not true.
Yeah, and I agree with that, and I'm glad that we picked Mouse for that reason, but I think we also need to be careful how we approach canon if we want to refer to a group of books as canon, because we've all had the experience of probably telling friends of ours, oh, if you like movies, you really should see Citizen Kane. It's this great, one of the greatest movies of all time, and it's such a build-up that we sometimes set ourselves up for failure. And I think that sometimes we can do that with comics and graphic novels as well. And that's what makes me a little bit hesitant to try to build up canon. Although I do want to get those books. I want to get those Mouse and Watchmen. I want to get those books in the hands of patrons. But I also want to take them where they are. And I think this is what I miss about teaching, is that personal connection, that relationship that you have with students. And I want to get to know these students and find out, what is it that you want to read? What is it that excites you? And to find that book. And, sometimes as a public librarian, we get to do that. We get to establish those relationships. And one of the things I always tell adults or kids, I'll try to put some books into their hands that I think they're going to like based on the conversations we've had. And I will always end the transaction with, come back and tell me what you liked and tell me what you didn't like. And when you tell me what you liked, I'll know what else I can recommend to you. And when you tell me what you don't like, I'll know what to stay away from.
Andy's hitting on the stuff that I try to help my students understand, which is what you like as a person, as a librarian, doesn't really matter when you're working with a patron. It should be all about them,
right.
And you've got to get to know them. You've got to make the time to listen to them and figure out the right questions to ask, so that whatever it is they're looking for, you have a chance of getting it in their hands.
So in this way, do you guys as librarians see yourselves as somewhat similar to, let's say, people who work in comic shops, right? Because ideally someone, if they have a local shop, I've heard many people say this, it's nice if they could go in and someone knows the kind of titles that they really appreciate, and they say, oh, this just came in, you may like this as well, knowing about, your reading habits.
Well, librarians have always done that.
But not selling them.
But yeah, I mean, that's the whole profession in a lot of ways. I mean, that's what we do. Yeah.
And I think we can always do better at it. I know I always feel like that there's more that I should know. If I knew half of the stuff that the guy at my local comic shop knows, I would be a much better reader's advisory librarian. There's just so much to know, and but that's one of the great things about it, is because you never stop learning.
Well, yeah, and that's true. And if I may tell another story, when I first started collecting for the public library, I actually attempted to read everything that we got in, and actually went through. This is when Amazon was pretty new. Every single title on Amazon.
Wow.
Okay, to see what was in print and what wasn't. Okay, I could never do that now. But it was possible in the late '90s to do that. So
now we've talked today about a number of challenges facing librarians when it comes to comics or graphic novel collections. Where do each of you see, maybe as a possible trajectory, or maybe even a challenge to overcome, however you want to look at this, where libraries are going with comics, or libraries' relationship with comics and their patrons?
So this is more of a wish than I think a prediction. But one of the things I really would like to see is, especially public libraries and probably academic, as could be included in there as well, is finding a way to collect and support local comics creators. I think it can be harder to buy outside the normal vendor channels. If Baker and Taylor doesn't have it, you may have a hard time getting it into your collection. But I think finding a way of supporting local creators, of finding a way of bringing in not just the trade paperbacks and the prestige volumes, but bringing in the floppies, bringing in unusual formats, finding out that comics, some of them may take a little bit more care and feeding, but that they're worth it. That comics, they're all about stories, they're all about information, just like all of the other materials we collect in libraries. And so figuring out how to really collect widely for our communities, I think, is my wish for where we go in libraries.
I would like to see more, at least at my institution and across the board, more faculty librarian interaction in academic settings related to comics and graphic novels. And also platforms, because I know that many academic libraries, there's a big push to go with the formats and things like that. So what do we have for comics and graphic novels that could be equivalent? Because we're really talking mainly about one of the last vestiges of print here, which I think is great. So
I would just say that I want our public library system and all of them really to have more variety, more diversity, and actually more educational opportunities, and not just opportunities for people to appreciate comics and graphic novels, but actually even more opportunities to even maybe create them. One of the things that we're looking at our branch is to create an atmosphere where we can bring in a comics creator and maybe do a workshop with people of all ages about just drawing, just basic drawing, doodling, maybe turning those into comics, maybe not, but just getting the creative juices flowing, just to get people doing something creative, whether that's art, drawing, painting, and writing, anything that stimulates the creative act, and whether that leads to an appreciation of comics, which I'm sure it will, but just an appreciation of the arts in general. And it's one thing for us to want people to read comics, which is a great thing. But I think we should also encourage people's creativity as far as making art, whether that's comics or whether that's prose or poetry, sculpture, any of those types of things. And I think comics can be a part of that.
So, I mean, that's maybe another way that librarians are like booksellers, because in comic shops and in bookstores like a Barnes & Noble, you know, it's quite frequent that they have people come in for signings or lectures or creative activities. So you're saying that more of this in libraries, and maybe that would get back to what, Carol, you were pointing out, more local engagement with those artists.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that with public libraries in particular, we have a rich history of programming activities. And for a long time, those have focused on young people. But I think in the last decade, we've seen an uptick in programming aimed at older teens and adults. And I think that comics programming and that kind of creative element fits really nicely in with that. I mean, certainly too within public libraries and some school libraries, we see an emphasis on maker spaces. And maker spaces don't just have to be about technology, you know, 3D printers and vinyl decal makers. They can be about making art, as Andy is suggesting.
Amen to that.
Well, on that amen, maybe this is a good point to wrap up. I want to thank you guys, Carol, Rob, and of course Andy, for this discussion on comics, graphic novels, and libraries.
Thanks, Derek.
Thank you, Derek. Andy,
yeah,
Carol.
Thanks, Derek.
Yeah,
it was a lot of fun.
Nice talking to all of you.
Wow, Derek, that was just a lot of fun. Not only for me being a librarian, talking with two other librarians, which, you know, something we don't do enough of as librarians, but just the wealth of knowledge that Rob and Carol bring to the table. This was just a lot of fun.
Yeah, it was. I mean, this is something we've been talking about for a while, and I'm glad that, you know, as we're about to enter a new school year, that we got the opportunity to have those guys on the show and to talk about the ins and outs of comics and libraries. And you guys were educating me. I was the ignorant one of the bunch.
Well, it was a lot of great things being talked about, and I certainly would love to talk with Rob and Carol again at some point.
Yes. And, you know, a lot of those titles that we were discussing, at one point, I'm sure you could order them through the website of our sponsor, dcbservice.com, because at one point they were new books, and you could pre-order them through Discount Comic Book Service. They have great deals. Make sure you visit them. They'll do you right when it comes to funny books. You can't find better prices. And after you do go there and pre-order your comics, get in touch with us and let us know the kind of things you're going to be reading. And also, let us know how things are at your local library when it comes to comics and graphic novels. You can get in touch with us by going to our website, comicsalternative.com, and on the right-hand side of your browser, you should find a tab that says Send Voicemail. Click on that, and from the comfort of your own desktop or mobile device, you can send us a message through the wonders of SpeakPipe. It's very simple to use. Or, if you want to be a little more difficult about things, you can call us over the telephone. Our phone number is 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
And if you would like to keep up with everything that's going on in the Comics Alternative universe, one of the best ways to do that is to follow us on Twitter. We are at the number 2 guys with PhDs, and we give updates to new content on the blog as well as the podcasts. And we certainly appreciate everyone who retweets our tweets.
That's right. You can also reach us via email. We're 2guys@comicsalternative.com. You can contact me individually. I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com. And Andy, how can they get in touch with you?
You can contact me at Wolverton at comicsalternative.com.
You can also find us on Facebook, on Tumblr, on Instagram, on Google+, and on Pinterest. We even have a YouTube channel, so you can get the podcast episodes that way. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn, and you can find every single one of our episodes, as well as our reviews and comics-related commentary that we put up on our blog. And that's at comicsalternative.com.
Yep, lots of different ways to find us.
That's right, and we do like to hear from you. Until then, though, I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy.
We'll see you later.